Now, according to the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 amendment, if Edward Snowden wants to be considered a refugee, he must first prove two things. First, that he has a well-founded fear of persecution based on his political opinions, and second, that his crime was either non-serious or politically charged. Now, on the first point, Snowden may be able to prove that he is being persecuted by the verbal assaults that he has received from one U.S. lawmaker after another. Meanwhile, Guardian reporter Glenn Greenwald, who broke the NSA surveillance story, is also in the spotlight. Take a look at how this case is unfolding in the media.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies.
The Russians right now are playing games with us. They clearly have the ability to turn him over.
He chose 3 countries so far that we know of, China, Russia, and possibly Cuba. These are 3 places that are notorious for spying on their own citizens.
You know, he gets into a country that's hostile to the U.S., we're not getting him back. And he's picked one of 3, you know, he could have gone to Cuba, Venezuela, or Ecuador, 3 most hostile to the U.S. In Central and South America.
So how is the media doing in its coverage of this case? Well, for more, I'm joined by Eric Wimple. He's a media critic at The Washington Post. Thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
So let's start off with your overall impressions of how the media is doing.
Well, I think the media, you know, it's taken some criticism from Snowden and other people for trivializing Edward Snowden's past and sort of getting distracted. But I think actually it's been a pretty good vessel for a serious debate about privacy. If you notice, for about 3 weeks now, all the op-ed pages and the television airwaves have filled up with a lot of back and forth. Is this a huge privacy problem? Is it not? It's been going back and forth. Is he a traitor? Is he a hero? Those are awfully simplistic terms, but there's been a lot of substantive discussion going on. I can't remember a time, at least in the past several years, where privacy has gotten a more thorough screening in the public.
Now, talk about the idea of different outlets covering this. Obviously, there are certain Republican outlets, there are certain Democratic outlets. Is there any ones that you could say are really hitting the mark or not hitting the mark?
Well, it's interesting that since this issue, since privacy is sort of a bipartisan issue, there's a strain on the left side of the political spectrum that doesn't like what's happening. And there's also a strain, there's a libertarian strain on the right that doesn't like it. So it's been a sort of kind of a fantastic mishmash on that front. You have, you know, sort of like media organizations that are traditionally conservative that hate what the Obama administration has been doing and the federal government has been doing, and you have outlets on the left that are doing the same. So it's been just sort of mind-boggling and head-spinning to watch as these various organizations, they all oftentimes saying the same things.
Have you seen any cases of media bias, or has it been pretty even keel?
Well, I think the main issue of bias here is the one that sort of came up, but it sort of surfaced yesterday in the clip, the David Gregory, Glenn Greenwald clip yesterday, in which you sort of saw, as a lot of people interpreted, kind of a bias against Glenn Greenwald. He's been an activist. He has been very outspoken, very opinionated in his feelings about the government and privacy and national security. So they kind of think that Glenn Greenwald is an activist, and therefore that he sort of hedges his views on Edward Snowden and on the NSA and everything, and that he's not perhaps the most objective person to be presenting the news. So I guess that if there's a bias question, that is certainly one of the foremost.
And that was the next topic I was going to talk to you about, is Glenn Greenwald and this kind of back and forth that he had with the Meet the Press. Meet the Press's David Gregory.
Right.
Now, some lawmakers have said that he should be prosecuted for aiding and abetting the enemy, because they say that he's not a journalist because he's expressed opinions. So my first question is, what qualifies as a journalist?
Well, I think that, you know, we're always sort of refurbishing, renovating our opinion of what just what a journalist. I think certainly in this case, Glenn Greenwald more than qualifies. He's presented public documents to the American public in context. You may disagree with him, but his facts have been basically more or less on target. He has presented documents which have not been debunked, which have not been declared false. So, I mean, I think that he has done the journalist job of bringing forth information that we wouldn't have had otherwise, and kicked off an enormous, as I say, an enormous debate about privacy and the government's role in protecting our national security, and whatever trade-off the President Obama cites there. I mean, I think that has been central. So I don't think that there's any way to impugn sort of Greenwald's work as a journalist in this case. Sure, he has an opinion, he has a point of view, but that's not incompatible with presenting facts.
So you don't think that he should or will be prosecuted by the U.S. Justice Department?
Well, from what I know, I certainly don't think that Glenn Greenwald should be prosecuted. No. From what I know, I mean, he has taken leaks from a person who has very important documents on our national security, and he has published them. The Washington Post has done the same thing. Fewer people, if any, have questioned whether the Washington Post has been an activist or whether it should be, you know, should be prosecuted on this. Of course, the Washington Post hasn't had quite as many exclusive as Glenn Greenwald, and doesn't have quite the relationship with Edward Snowden that Glenn Greenwald does. But still, I mean, if the New York Times, I believe it was their executive editor, Jill Abramson, was quoted, I believe, by her public editor as being somewhat envious of the story that other outlets have had. Every news organization in the country wanted this story. So, I mean, the notion that we should be prosecuting journalists over this is just insane. I mean, that's tyranny.
We just have 30 seconds left, but should journalists be afraid of the Obama administration?
Well, I think there's documentary evidence to that effect. They should certainly be wary of the Obama administration. I mean, look what they did with the AP and with James Rosen and Fox News. In both cases, they secretly eavesdropped on journalists, and we don't like that. No one should like that. I mean, no one should have their emails or their phone calls looked at by the government in any way without notice.
Eric Wemple, media critic at the Washington Post, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.